So good afternoon. After the lunch, everybody has settled down. Apologize for the delay in beginning this session. We had some problems, I think, with the lunch and a little bit problems with uploading the presentations. We also have a slightly different program than the one that is in the program you have. Unfortunately, this particular session was hit by medical problems. Originally, Angela Sasse from University College London expected to be here. We were very much hoping to be here, but then a medical emergency made it impossible for her to travel. And yesterday we heard from Shehzad Rafaeli from Haifa University that he has a high fever and will not be able to come. So we only have now 3 speakers, which allows us a little bit more time and which also doesn't make it so terrible that we start late. So we will deal here with behavioral aspects of cybersecurity in contrast to some of the more technical problems, for instance, this previous session on crypto addressed. As you will see, the term behavioral aspects covers a wide range of different approaches, and I think the 3 presenters, the 2 others and myself in this session provide some different views of the problems. So allow me to present very briefly the 2 presenters. The first one is my colleague, Dr. Eran Toch. He's at the Department of Industrial Engineering, a senior lecturer, and we share actually the Interacting with Technology lab at the department. Eran's group works on various projects related to usable privacy and cybersecurity. He is a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, and he holds a PhD from the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, and spent a number of years at Carnegie Mellon University doing research on privacy and human-computer interaction. So this is the first speaker, and I will just introduce immediately the second speaker who will speak after Eran. This is Professor Chris Demchak. Professor Demchak is the RADM Grace M. Hopper Professor of Cybersecurity and the co-director of the Center for Cyber Conflict Studies at the Strategic Research Department at the US Naval War College. Her research and her many publications address global cyberspace influences from a rising cyber Westphalia, and I think she may explain what this is, to the security of complex socio-technical economic systems as globally shared. Insecure substrates penetrating throughout the critical organizations of digitized democratic civil societies. Professor Demchak, to some extent, personifies the multidisciplinarity of the field in that she has degrees in engineering and in social sciences and is able to, in the research, to combine the different approaches. So we'll start with with Dr. Toch, and then Professor Demchak, and I'll present my work a little bit at the end. So, Eran, please.
So, hi everybody. Thank you, Joachim, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here after lunch. I'm going to talk about choice architectures and cybersecurity. So this is basically, I'm going to show several studies done by Ron Hirschsprung, which is this guy, towering over me in this photo. He recently finished his PhD, and he was also co-advised by Professor Oded Maimon from our department. So let's start with access control. In almost every cybersecurity scenario, the decisions that systems make originate from what users, administrators, or end users are doing using some sort of interface for access control. It can be, network access or our privacy settings on Facebook. All of them share a very similar model in which we say which kind of resource can be accessed by which kind of person or user or system and in which context. So even if we go to, more philosophical ideas of privacy, of how do we control our information, the main idea that, most of the legislation and regulation by OECD, US, Europe, Israel, basically look at control as the cornerstone of how privacy is kept. So if the user has effective control, okay, or as Alan Weston, the philosophical father of modern privacy says, if individuals can claim and to determine for themselves what happens with their information, then they have privacy. And it's very similar for security. So we see control interfaces everywhere. We see them on our iPhone, we see them on our browsers, we see them, again, with Facebook, something that I will return to a couple of times in this talk. We see them in LinkedIn, and all of us as humans need to, manage our access from time to time. But the main question we have, and that's, a political question for privacy and a very practical question for security, is how well can we manage this kind of control? Are users really in control? So if we look, for example, at a user interface from Facebook at 2009, in which the user should, choose very simply, from several options, what kind of information, the general public, his friends, her friends, or specific groups of friends can access. So we see that we see several things here. First, there are many options, but there are three main options. Most users will not go into the custom settings somewhere over here and somewhere over here and make all those very nitty-gritty, fine-grained decisions. They will probably choose among those three options, okay? If anybody here has ever helped their father or mother or grandparents to manage Facebook privacy settings, everybody here ever done that? So I've done that, and this is actually very, very hard and very, very complicated. Most people will go with those three. Another interesting thing is that the default choice is public. So if you don't do anything, if you just click next, 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 that would be the default choice and your information would be public. So that was in 2009 in Facebook. That actually created some kind of uproar and some regulation. But if we look at this interface, then we might start to think that the question of control isn't very simple. It's not just what users are doing, it's in which architecture they make their choices. And indeed, the idea of choice architecture, this is a concept that Tversky and Kahneman later got a Nobel Prize for this kind of thinking. But it's a more general idea in economics and in other fields. So we know that the way we make our choices, the way the interaction of making our choices is built, the order of choices, what are the defaults, what are the colors, even very small differences can make a huge impact on what users are actually doing. One of the most amazing, I think, results is in organ donation. So, for example, in Israel, we have a lot of discourse on why people are not donating enough organs. Okay, why is that? Can you give me ideas? What's the problem? The religious people are to blame. That's the general idea among non-religious people. But if we look, for example, a study done by in Europe, in which they compared different countries, okay, and looked at the organ donation proportion of citizens, then we see that there are countries like Germany in which the proportion of organ donors are about 12%. This is very much like the Israeli average. And we see countries like Austria, which is, okay, I wouldn't go into, but it's very, very similar to Germany in every cultural, legal aspect. We see the proportion of organ donors are 99%. So what's the difference between the countries in yellow and the countries in blue? Yeah, should people opt in? Should they, make make a mark if they want to be organ donors, or should they opt out? Should they make a mark if they don't want to be organ donors? And this very small, thing on a very small form, okay, a very simple form, creates a huge difference between the proportion of organ donors, okay? So that shows you how the defaults, and this is a very important part of choice architecture, really impact what users are doing. And we see effects of choice architecture in many, many fields, in organ donation, but also, for example, in access control to groupware calendars, in privacy settings. We see that the way the defaults are selected makes a huge choice, and a huge impact. And choice architectures are very wide, but in this talk I'm going to focus only on the defaults, on what are the default options, meaning from which small set of options the user can choose, and what is the default choice. So what is the kind of recommended or pre-selected choice done by the system. We also know that defaults can actually make things very easy for users. So a very nice book, The Paradox of Choice, basically shows that in our very modern, consumer-oriented world, choices can actually make us suffer. Okay, so if you go to a shop and there are many, many types of jeans, it will be much harder than if you only have 3 types of jeans. And that goes to user interactions. So if we can actually create a small set of choices, but these are the right choices, and I'm going to talk about what exactly is the right choice, then we can make the task of the user much easier, much closer to the user's original preferences, and perhaps better for the whole system. So my focus here is going to be on engineering. That's because I'm an engineer and I love engineering. So I'm not going to talk about theory. I'm not going to talk about what happens if you change the defaults, for example. But I'm going to speak about 3 types of results that we got. First of all, trying to find the optimal set of defaults, and I'm going to talk about what is exactly the optimal set of defaults. A method for analyzing the defaults of systems and seeing if actually the defaults serve the preferences of users, and finding the value of preferences. So if you can know how important is a preference for a user, then we can tailor the defaults to match that user's preferences. So let's start with finding optimal defaults. This is a paper published in Transactional Intelligence Systems and Technology about a year ago. And the question here is, okay, so let's assume that we know something about preferences of users. How can we find the best set of defaults for those users? So imagine that there is some distribution of preferences. So let's say this is Facebook. Everybody knows and loves Facebook, or at least knows Facebook. So let's say that there are different options for sharing information on Facebook. Some are more open, so you share with the whole public or a larger set of friends, and some are less open. So you share with very small set of friends, or maybe just with yourself. And we have different users. So users, differ. Some users like to share more information. Some users like to share less information. And here I'm going to assume for a short while that users are consistent. This isn't the case in the actual world. So some information I want to share with more people, some information I want to share with less people, but let's assume now that users want to share all their information on a certain level. So we have users, we have preferences, and these are the defaults. So these are the options of sharing, okay? So we can say, for example, that a user is covered, okay? A user has his preferences or her preferences covered if there is a close enough default choice that we can choose. So a good social welfare function for these defaults would be by looking at the coverage of these defaults. So if we can say that all users are covered by some default option, which means that all users have at least one option which is close enough to their actual preferences, then this would be a good and usable system. Bad defaults, okay, would be defaults. For example, we can see here that somebody maybe on Facebook had pushed the defaults more to the public, they pushed it to the more open side of the spectrum, which means that there's one user here which has good enough defaults, but there are many users here which don't have close enough defaults. So those would be bad defaults. So we can model this as an optimization problem, and we can look at a bunch of defaults and then select from those possible candidates for defaults, the defaults that represent as many users as possible. We've actually done that. We've run a survey of 352 participants. We asked them about their sharing preferences in several types of scenarios. For example, the scenario of sharing documents, imagine Google Doc, medical information, emails. For example, in Gmail, Google looks at your email, so you can, we asked users how much do they want Google to look at their emails, etc. And we've found we try to find the automatic set of defaults. And we try to see what's the percentage of participants that we can cover. And I think the interesting results that we can cover, I would say a satisfactory proportion of participants in some domains. So some domains are easier than other domains, for example, medical information. So we were able to cover with 3 defaults about 90% of the population. With other fields, it's different. תעשו אינטראקציה קטנה. Which basically means that if we run an algorithm on what users actually want, and we have a set of defaults, and we can find a small set of defaults that really cover a lot of what users are wanting, which means that we can make the interaction more usable and find something that users actually want. We've used a very similar technique, and this is a paper that's recently submitted to a journal, to evaluate existing systems. So we've created an application that basically gets information from Facebook users. We pay them some money for their information. We've analyzed what they've done in the last 3 months prior to running this experiment, and we try to understand what are the privacy preferences with their actual information. And then we try to look at the optimal set of defaults against the defaults of Facebook themselves. And we can see that we can cover with our automatic set of defaults about 85% of users. There's a difference between users and choices. I'm not going to go into that. While Facebook defaults cover about 75 to 78%. So to give you some example, with 2 defaults from the optimal set, we can cover as many users as what Facebook is doing with free choices. Okay, so that's quite the different type of user interaction. And what we see, for example, when we analyze what Facebook is actually doing, is that Facebook really, at least in that time, that was 2013, really pushed users to more openness than they wanted. For example, there was a choice called Friends of Friends. Friends of Friends. Almost nobody uses that, apparently. It's very seldom that people use that, but Facebook has it on its user interface, and that's really something that users don't want. So if we eliminate that and replace that with something that users want, then we have a better coverage of users. I'm going to answer questions at the end. Okay? So the next thing that we've done is trying to look at the values of preferences, and that's a paper which was recently accepted to Computers and Human Behavior. And in that paper, we asked ourselves the following. So imagine that coverage basically say, do users have a close enough option? But that's not always the case, because some users might actually feel very strongly about a choice. So if you're a very private user, then a public option would be very difficult for you. So there's a difference in the value. Some privacy preferences and security preferences are stronger than others, but asking users about their privacy is very futile. So there are several interesting results saying that if you have a survey and you ask users how important privacy to you, that basically teaches you the ideas of the user, but the behavior of the user is very, very different. So behavior and attitude differ very strongly in privacy. It's even named the privacy paradox. So we've tried to build a mechanism that can allow us to understand the value of privacy, and we've done that with a sort of experiments done by economists using prospect theory. We basically looked at an e-commerce scenario, and we paid users according to their performance in the study. And we showed them what kind of information would be shown about them to other users, and then at the end, we've told them that whether the information was actually used or not. And then we've run sort of a binary search. We've randomized different values, and we've done a directed binary search. I'm not going to explain what that is, to find the best value. So we see that the main thing that we wanted to know is whether the values will converge, whether through several iterations, we could see that users have finally found a value that they find fitting, and we see that in different types of products that the number of users who converge goes, the proportion of users who didn't find a value goes down very steeply, and after 5 iterations, you can find the convergence for about 60% of the users. We can get the value of, let's say, privacy, or how much a user will be willing to pay for not disclosing the information. For different types of products, some products are more sensitive than others. Some products are less sensitive than others. We see products which are more sensitive than others, like this one, have a higher value for privacy. We compare those results to actual experiments in which people actually bought, actual data analysis in which people actually bought the same kind of product, and we see very high correlation. And another interesting thing is that, and that's very much, according to what prospect theory will predict, is that the probability of the information disclosure also plays a big part in the value. So if the probability is higher, and we didn't tell users that probability, they learned that through the study, then users would require a higher value. Last thing, so we took those values, and now let's say that for each user we have different value of their privacy, and now we need to define the default choices. So now we can start talking in economic terms about which user interface will be the best. So imagine that the user interface is the same for all users. This is the design pattern in user-computer interaction currently. So we want a standard user interface. And now we can look at user interface that with the best coverage, the best utility, so that could be the average utility or the sum of utilities, etc., and even indexes of fairness. So we use Jane, which is a slightly better version of the fairness that you all know. And we can actually look at, for example, the configuration threshold, that's the amount of discount that the user would want for their privacy, and see how well these different indexes would be. So for example, if we move here, we see that average utility goes high, but coverage goes down, and fairness is somewhere in the middle. So we can now do some actual analysis of user interactions and say how well they can serve their users. And that's good for regulators that can make decisions, for example, about what to expect of systems, for designers that make systems, and for users. So just a couple of, I'm going to finish by asking questions rather than say something meaningful. So one thing that I hope that you take from this short lecture is the power of choice architectures, the power of defaults, the power of the way we create the user interfaces. That makes a huge impact on the privacy of users and also on their security. So if you make the choice architecture, if you push users to one side or the other, you might get a bad system or you might get a good one. We can start thinking in engineering terms of how to create those choice architectures. And at the end, we can start thinking about value. So if we think how much a certain value is important for users, then we can create fitting and more usable systems. So that's it. Thank you again. I'm going to thank Ron Hirschsprung. That's his work. Oded Maimon, his co-advisor. And of course, the guys that gave me money, which is the Israel Cyber Bureau grant. So thank you. Thank you. So 1 or 2 questions, I'm being told. Yes, over there. That's not true. That's not true. No, that's not true. That's a myth. That's a myth. So, first of all, that's really a myth. Actually, Israelis are, think a lot about privacy. But to your question, so all of those studies were done in the US using Mechanical Turk. I'm not going to go into that, but that's a very certain population. But the idea was to actually keep the culture kind of stable. So we didn't do that. There are many interesting differences between users and between cultures, even though most of the studies have shown that the differences are smaller than we think. So Americans, privacy in the US is a very political question. But if you look at what users are actually doing, their behavior, and if you also look at the legal framework, then we see that it's actually less private than Israel. So we have this sort of idea in our head, but it doesn't always, goes with what users are actually doing. Yeah. I didn't talk about it. Okay. Yeah, they do. It's indeed fascinating. I do know of one study that I didn't do that, somebody else has done, that looked at that, and I will happily share it later. Okay? Thank you.